"I will shoot them all," I hear a voice of rage say. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time I've heard someone make such a claim in my office in 17 years as a therapist and a psychologist. I know I must keep the public safe in this situation, but what do I do to help this young man who's obviously in very, very deep distress? I think most people hear something like this and they go, "I would want no part of that. I don't want to be in the room with this kid." For me, perhaps oddly, there's no place I'd rather be. I can't really explain it. I've always had this sort of odd ability to form connections with people who sometimes struggle to form connections. So I can offer that to this young man, and perhaps in this moment it reconnects him to society just a little bit. But this is probably not enough, right, for someone that's experiencing this level of distress. So where else do I turn? I can turn to psychiatry and psychology, and look, they've offered a lot over the last 100 years or so. Most of their interventions, though, locate distress, like the kind this young man is feeling, inside the person. Now, some of that is genetics and biology, right? And I'll talk more about that later. Some of it is the sort of fierce individualistic nature of the culture that we live in, right? So do I take psychology and psychiatry up on their offer and locate this distress inside of this young man? Or do I go a different route, perhaps a more systemic route? Do I look at his proposal to indiscriminately open fire on his fellow human beings as one that has been co-authored by the culture of the United States? And perhaps co-authored in a way that exists just below the surface of his awareness. Right. Now, when I say co-authored, I think I owe you a little bit more of an explanation here. What I mean are systems that put pressure on people's identities. Systems that have something to say culturally about who people can be and who they can't be. So a couple of examples. Guns in our culture, in the United States, right? Fair to say we have a unique relationship with guns. So things like the Second Amendment, right? The right to bear arms and the various interpretations of that. The NRA, the National Rifle Association. Now, you could think these things are good, bad, or indifferent. That's for you to decide. But it's hard to deny that these don't put pressure on people's identities. They don't have something to say about who people think they're allowed to be. Another one in the case of this young man, masculinity. Right? What does it mean to be a man in the culture? How can men behave when they feel hurt, when they feel angry, when they feel disenfranchised, when they have a grievance? Right? Now, I could give you many more systems that were impacting this young man's life, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what I mean when I say co-authored by the systems of the culture. Okay? Think of it this way. If this young man wasn't living in this particular place at this particular moment in time, would he be threatening to engage in a mass shooting? And listen to my language, mass shooting. I mean, we've had to construct language to describe this, which I think is rather telling, right? How is it that we've come to think of mental health as such an individualized project? How is it that we've come to think of people's relationships with guns as so individualized? How is it that we believe we can separate either of these from the cultural context in which they were created? I want to smash cut here to April of 2019, right? So earlier this year. A woman named Sol Paez traveled from Florida to Colorado with the alleged intent to open fire on Colorado school children. Right? Now, this is an interesting instance because she's a woman, and historically most mass shooters have been male-identified. Right? But, according to multiple media reports, she was sort of infatuated with the Columbine shooters, so this idea of masculinity is still very present, even if she doesn't identify as male. Right? And certainly the relationship with guns in the culture is still present. Okay? So Sol Paez travels to Colorado. The day after she arrives, virtually all the major school districts in the Denver metropolitan area cancel classes. We're talking hundreds of schools, tens of thousands of students. Late in that day, they find Sol Paez dead, and I closely monitor the media reaction. And I hear things like this and read things like this on Twitter and the various social media outlets. Sol Paez found, the scare is over. Think about that more deeply for just a moment. The scare is over? The scare is over. This is the kind of idea you get when you locate distress inside of a person. What you get is a disordered person. What you ignore are the ways in which the culture is disordered. Imagine for a moment that you're an oncologist and you're working with someone whose body is being ravaged by cancer. You and your team, you go in and you remove a single cancer cell surgically. And you say, "We've removed a cancer cell. The scare is over." Thank you, that's how I felt too. It's preposterous, right? Because we understand that this is one cancer cell among many others. Moreover, we understand that these cancer cells are threatening the very vitality of the still healthy cells moment by moment, right? So when it comes to cancer, we understand we must treat this systemically. Why don't we understand the same thing when it comes to mental health? Why don't we understand the same thing when it comes to mental health and gun violence, as media pundits and politicians talk about ad nauseum? Why do we think that removing a person from a sick system fixes anything? Now, I want you to know that this idea of locating distress inside the physical bodies of people, this doesn't just impact my work in very sort of drastic situations, it impacts it in all sorts of situations, right? If I could back up for just a moment, though, the young man, I think I owe you an explanation. What kind of work did we do together? And I'm sharing this story with his consent, by the way. So I formed a relationship with him, as I said, right? That's a good place to start, but it's not enough. I upheld my ethical obligations to keep the public safe. But then in the days and weeks that followed, what we started to do is interrogate the systems that were putting pressure on his identity, as I was talking about earlier. As it turns out, he had adopted ideas about guns without his own consent. He thought these were the ideas you must hold about guns, being a man in the United States, right? So we reauthored this. We formed more preferred relationships with guns for him. We did the same with masculinity. You know, in the United States and perhaps other places, but we're here in the United States, there's a very narrow description for masculinity that one must fit into. He didn't fit into that, and for a lot of reasons then felt disconnected from society and from what it means to be a man. So we reauthored his idea of masculinity. Now, we could have stopped there, but it wouldn't have been enough because this is not an individualistic endeavor. This is a community endeavor. So what we did is we invited his family, his friends, to stand in support of this new identity. Frankly, it offends my soul when we think that we can pull someone out of a systemic problem, right, and blame them for that. So what I want to move towards is a more systemic model of care, right, and a less individualistic model of care. Okay. Now, as I was noting, this is sort of heavy. Maybe it has to be, but I want you to know that these ideas of locating distress inside the bodies of people, this impacts all the work I do. I'll give you another example, if I might. Share a story of a woman a young mother who had given birth 4 or 5 months ago and was feeling very, very depressed. Okay? She said, "Look, all my family and friends say, take care of yourself." Self-care, right? We all heard that term before, self-care. And she goes, "Look, I'm trying to do it, but it's not helping." And then she drops her voice to a whisper, almost as if she's about to say something taboo, and she goes, "Look, sometimes it's actually making me feel worse." Her head drops in despair, and then she says, "I can't even self-care right." Those words still reverberate through my being. I can't even self-care right. Now, look, I think self-care came from a good place. It came as a way to try to invite care into people's lives. I think that's a good thing. Moreover, what I don't think may be so good is if we believe that the distress exists in the self, then how do we heal the self? With self-care, right? How might we do this a little more systemically? Now, in March of earlier this year, there was a study released by the University of Colorado at Boulder. It was examining what's called the candidate gene hypothesis for depression. Basically, the candidate gene hypothesis for depression is a lot of big words to say that there's a gene that causes depression. For the last 20 years or so, that's sort of been the trajectory. We thought it was only a matter of time until we find this gene. So these researchers looked over studies that had tens of thousands, even some studies, hundreds of thousands of participants, and much to their surprise, they found no support for the candidate gene hypothesis for depression. None. They were more shocked than anyone. The thing about this is that idea that depression must be of us is so deeply rooted in the water supply that we don't even think to challenge it. Now, I'm not here to say there's no genetic influence to depression. That's a bridge too far. I think there's probably genetic influences, right? What I'm worried, though, is that we're looking so much at the genetic influences that we're ignoring perhaps more systemic influences. Okay? Now, if I could go back to the woman I was talking about who was feeling depressed after giving birth, so what did we do together? Well, I asked her a question. I said, hey, if you lived in a society where male partners, and this is a heteronormative example, excuse that, it's just she had a male partner. If you lived in a society where 50% of all child-rearing duties were taken up by men, do you think you'd feel more depressed or less depressed? That was her reaction, and she goes, oh, less depressed. And would it surprise you to know I've asked many women this question over the last decade plus, and unanimously they say less depressed. Now, you could say, well, those are her words, she's just saying that. Well, we put this to the test. We get a systemic intervention. We invite her male partner in to stand in support of her in these ways, and do you know what happens to the depression? It starts to go down. If this is something that's located solely in her, then why does a systemic intervention cause it to go down, right? What it seems like we're doing in this case, and other cases like it, is we're asking a woman to self-care her way out of social inequity. That feels like a bad recipe to me, okay? So what do I propose as an alternative? Maybe we'd call it communities of care. Now, when I say that, the first thing people think is, oh, it's like group therapy, people getting together and talking about distress. While I think that can be lovely, I think it ignores one very important variable, and that variable is power, okay? When I talk about communities of care, well, can you imagine for a moment, like for those of us who have relative positions of power in the room, right? If you go, oh, communities of care, this sounds very kumbaya, this is great. If you start doing this work, I'll warn you, it's painful, because what you start to do is you interrogate the systems in which you have power over, and you often find out that you are holding up values and ideas that you don't even stand for. But those values and ideas are so deeply woven into the culture that you don't realize you're standing for them, right? Now, this could be at home, this could be in the workplace, this could be in your community, right? It could be all over. I can't tell you how to interrogate these systems because your systems are unique to you, but I feel like I owe you a general example. So let's take the workplace. In the workplace where you're in a relative position of power, are you dehumanizing, even if unwittingly, dehumanizing people through overwork? Are you defining their character, their worth as a human being by whether or not they produce? Right? These kinds of ideas. If we start in our relative positions of power to change these systems, guess what? People don't have to self-care their way out of them then, right? Because we are systemically taking this on. Look, the way self-care currently exists, largely in the Western world, is a lot like a boxing match. You have two people in the ring beating the hell out of one another. They go to their neutral corners for 60 seconds. They put the little glue over the cut so it doesn't gush blood, and they put some ice over the swelling to bring it down. But the problem is, we send them right back into the ring to start getting bludgeoned again. And I don't think this is a sustainable model. So do we, thank you, do we have the courage, like when we see this young man who's threatening violence, do we have the courage to say, no, we're not just going to pick him out because he's problematic. We're going to look at the ways in which the systems we're a part of are holding up the very values that are pushing him to this point. When there's a young mother, right, who's feeling depressed, do we tell her, well, she needs to go get treatment, or do we look at the ways in which we're upholding systems that help along this depression? Reimagine the possibilities for a moment if we begin to understand that your care is bound up in mine and mine in yours. Thank you.